former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
As violence against people, institutions, and property continues unabated in cities across the nation, is it right for President Trump to send in federal agents to restore the order that Democrat leaders refuse to restore? Or is this just a law and order strategy that's all about the election? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Has Black Lives Matter had its moment? Or will we continue to witness unchecked violence in urban America right through the election? What is the actual specific agenda of Black Lives Matter and those who support it? And why is Joe Biden still comfortably ahead of President Trump in all those public polls? We'll consider those questions and more when we're joined by LibertyNation.com's political columnist Joe Schaeffer and Socio-Political correspondent Jeff Charles. Plus, we'll examine the state of liberty with LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza in Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. The election is just over 3 months away, and despite rarely leaving his basement, Joe Biden continues to hold a commanding lead in public polls. But let's, right up front, ask the question the media dares not ponder. Just how accurate are these polls, all of which, except one, were dead wrong in 2016? I want to take you back 4 years and listen to John Heilman, widely viewed as one of the mainstream's sharpest political analysts, and what he said about the polls the morning after the 2016 election.
Polling is broken, like in a profound, deep way, and the Clinton campaign was really genuinely convinced, up until 8:30 last night, that they were totally fine in Pennsylvania, they were going to win Michigan, they were going to win Wisconsin, they were going to be fine in Colorado, that they had the whole thing in hand, and genuinely confident about that. Their numbers were as messed up as the public polling is. And it's not just in America. We say, obviously, Brexit's a really good example, but there's a bunch of examples in Western Europe.
So what that says essentially is that the way polling was always done is no longer reliable, because there's so many voters, particularly pro-Brexit in England and pro-Trump here, who refuse to either participate in the polls or will deliberately give a deceptive answer. And it seems in the current racially supercharged environment we find ourselves in, voters are more likely than ever not to give honest answers for fear of being targeted by the left. But here we are 4 years later, and the same John Heilman who admitted polling is broken is now so convinced from the current polls of an inevitable Joe Biden victory that he went on MSNBC this week and said the president sending federal troops to cities where Democrats in charge refuse to stop violence is little more than a strategy for stealing the election.
This is authoritarianism. These are paramilitary units. These are the kinds of things that we have seen in tyrannical, authoritarian regimes in third world countries throughout the second half of the 20th century. I don't want to be overly alarmist about this, but I think this is the time to be alarmist, knowing where Donald Trump stands right now politically, understanding where we are headed in this election. I think we are looking at potentially a trial run for a kind of a genuine attempt to through intimidation and potentially through force to try to steal this election.
What paranoid leftist statements like that achieve, if you think about it, is lay the groundwork for the left to challenge any kind of Trump victory by claiming he stole it somehow. And you're hearing the same thing all over the left, that Trump will try to either steal the election or, in the case of the nation's most powerful Democrat, Nancy Pelosi, that after his certain defeat, Trump might have to be removed from the White House like a cockroach.
Whether he knows it yet or not, he will be leaving. Just because he might not want to move out of the White House doesn't mean we won't have an inauguration ceremony to inaugurate a duly elected president of the United States. It has nothing to do with that the certain occupant of the White House doesn't feel like moving and has to be fumigated out of there.
Of course, the laughable irony in all this is that the left has spent the last almost 4 years utterly refusing to accept the legitimate outcome of the last election. So they are now engaged in more of their famous projecting unto others that which they are guilty of themselves. A corresponding election strategy for the Democrats is to allow the violence and chaos in the streets of multiple major cities to go unchecked, unpoliced, hoping that the voters will blame Trump for their failure to keep cities like New York, Chicago, Seattle, and Portland safe. Already, the leftist mayor of Portland, Oregon, says Trump sending federal agents to guard federal buildings, federal property in Portland, is fascistic. But Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton used historical context to put the lie to that.
The federal government cannot allow anarchists and insurrectionists to destroy federal courthouses, federal buildings, or other federal property. These insurrectionists in the streets of Portland are little different from the insurrectionists who seceded from the Union in 1861 in South Carolina and tried to take over Fort Sumter. And just like President Lincoln wouldn't stand for that, the federal government today cannot stand for the vandalism, the firebombing, or any attacks on federal property. It is right to send federal law enforcement in to defend federal property and federal facilities.
One wonders if the Democrats' presidential standard bearer, Joe Biden, will say something, anything, about the destruction going on across our urban landscape. But he apparently believes staying silent works most to his advantage, a strategy that's working for now because the media refuses to question him about it, even as we now put together that Biden has held a grand total of one press conference in the last 100 days. But Biden apparently believes one of the ways to increase his chances for victory is to declare that we should teach our kids more about Muslims, as he did in an appearance from his basement this week directed at an Islamic organization.
I can't thank you enough for all you've done so far, and that's thank you for taking the time for watching today. Look, one of the things I think is important, I wish we taught more in our schools about the Islamic faith. Muslim Americans' voices matter to our communities, to our country, but we all know that your voice hasn't always gotten recognized or represented and or the recognition it deserves.
Joe Biden making a play for the Muslim vote like no candidate we've ever seen. And believe it or not, there was actually a second Joe Biden sighting this week on, where else? MSNBC, where the vice president, who's done nothing during the entire COVID crisis, now throws rocks from the sidelines at President Trump.
No country has ever done what we've done in terms of testing. We are the envy of the world.
I think he's right. No country has ever done what we've done. Walk away. There is no leadership here. He actually has zero. He's surrendered. He talked about it, remember, early on. This is going to go away in a few days. This is going to be gone tomorrow. You're going to wake up and be gone. He talked about how we were going to be in a position where we were going to be able to lead the world, et cetera. And he was going to be a wartime president fighting this virus. Well, he raised the white flag. He has no idea what to do. I've never seen a president who has been so self-serving in the conduct of the office.
Notice what you didn't hear there. Any solutions, any alternatives, any plan of his own. And of course, no mention of how the single most significant move Trump made in this crisis, shutting down travel from China, was a move that Biden attacked for being xenophobic. Will the voters believe Biden could have done better than Trump with the pandemic? Who knows? We've never had people vote in the midst of a pandemic before. Finally, if you watched that long interview of President Trump by Chris Wallace on Fox News last weekend, You probably understand better than ever why Mr. Wallace has become so widely disliked by conservatives and Fox viewers. Yes, he's likely left-leaning, and yes, he's desperate for the approval of the Trump-deranged elite media. We know that. But rarely, if ever, have we seen a journalist interview a president and devote almost 10 minutes of it to himself.
Some people were surprised when you agreed to this interview, to sit down with me, especially because of some of the mean tweets that you've said about me. But here's the question. One of your beefs seems to be that I put Democrats on the show and I ask them questions. And I guess the question I have is, don't you understand it's my job? You sent one tweet after I interviewed Nancy Pelosi. And in the interview, I asked her specifically, it's not true. If watch the James Comey interview I did in December, you couldn't do as tough an interview with Comey.
Chris Wallace mentions I, me, or my a dozen times in those 34 seconds I just played you. The fact that Chris Wallace even continues to be employed at Fox News is a testimony to how much Fox News has changed since the death of the man who made it what it is, Roger Ailes. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss whether the things Black Lives Matter is demanding are actually helping black communities.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The progressive priesthood and its exploitation agenda. How much have name changes, white actors bowing out of roles, and gigantic Black Lives Matter Boulevard murals help the black American community? That's the title and subtitle of an important column this week from LibertyNation.com. Socio-Political correspondent Jeff Charles addressing the question that actually matters amidst the widespread criminal behavior in our great cities, masquerading as a social justice movement. And Jeff joins us now. Hello, Jeff.
Hey, Tim. How you doing?
I'm doing well, and I want to read a quote from your story and then have you comment on it. You say, whenever progressives launch a campaign ostensibly designed to benefit minorities, it's reasonable to assume that they have an alternate agenda, one that has nothing to do with those they say they are helping. So, precisely what is the agenda for the Black Lives Matter movement beyond condemning and doing all they can to eradicate what they call a structure of white supremacy?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when you're looking at the Black Lives Matter organization, we're talking about the national Black Lives Matter organization, because there's a difference between the overarching, what I call Black Lives Matter Inc., and then like the more local groups and just people who are on board with the movement itself. Mm-hmm. Now, the objective of the Black Lives Matter movement, if you go to their website, you'll see it in the What We Believe section. You're going to see a lot of stuff in there, but what you won't see is any mention of the police or police brutality. Now, that is why the movement was originally started, was to address police reform. But when you look on their website, you see very little about it. It's mostly about pushing an agenda that has to do more with a white progressive Marxism than it does with protecting Black lives. You see a lot of things about like the LGBT community. You see things about eradicating the nuclear family in the Black community. So this doesn't really have much to do with saving Black lives. It's a whole other agenda that is basically what I call white progressive blackface, because that is what's going on here.
Every time we see an episode of violence in the streets, it seems that there are white people in the middle of it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I called the National Black Lives Matter organization. These are white progressives in blackface, because these are the people that are going out there rioting. I'm not saying that there's no Black people rioting. That is happening. But if you look at what happened in Portland and with that, the police officer, Officer Jakari, who basically talked about when he's seeing these protests and he's out there trying to, do what he can to mitigate it, it's mostly white people. And the white people are discouraging Black people from even having a dialogue with the police officer. So this is not Black Lives Matter. This is a very white-driven organization, white progressive-driven organization.
It's remarkable the number of white people who are anxious to publicly express their shame at being white.
Progressives always do these virtue signaling type of deals where they're going to build a mural, but they're not going to try to affect real change in the community. they'll do these surface level things that don't really matter, but it gives them the ability to say, hey, look at how great I am, Black people. This is what I'm willing to do for you. And there are a lot of Black people, not just on the right, but Black people who vote Democrats who are calling this out. And I've even seen some on Twitter being sarcastic about it. Okay, so you can do a mural, you can change the name of your band, but you won't actually work for police reform. You won't actually work to affect change.
Jeff, I get this creeping feeling, just a feeling, can't prove it, from observing all this mayhem in the streets, that there must be many, many Black people who are actually uncomfortable or even alarmed at being lumped together with Black Lives Matter and might quietly reject the Democrats or not vote. Is there any logic to that, do you think?
Yes, yeah, that's actually more spot on than you might think. Most Black people are on board with the Black Lives Matter as a concept. You might see them marching with signs saying Black Lives Matter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're attached to the national organization. And what we're seeing now is we see people in New York and Minneapolis, Black community leaders speaking out against this whole defund the police movement, because again, they know that this has nothing to do with helping Black people. As a matter of fact, it's going to harm Black people, and it's not going to harm the people pushing for it. So there are a lot of Black men and women who are angry about this. You're not going to hear about it though, because CNN's not going to cover this. MSNBC is not going to show you these people. They do pop up in certain reports and certain local reports, but I think that there are a lot of Black people who are pushing back against this. Black people want law and order. They just don't want police officers to be able to abuse their power and get away with it. So they're more likely to go for police reform instead of defunding the police.
Jeff, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Jeff Charles, LibertyNation.com. We'll break away for a moment, then come back to ask the question, is Joe Biden actually enjoying the type of lead the public polls suggest? Seriously?
Ready, set, go.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com, because we put the power of the press in your hands. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, liberty.
Today.
All the time and everywhere.
Liberty Nation connected the dots between a Chinese research biolab and a wet market where COVID-19 was supposedly discovered 2 months before the MSM. We were first to alert you of a serious attack on gun rights in Virginia. LN honed in on the Biden-Burisma scandal months before it hit the papers. We brought you exclusive interviews from the border.
We're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation was on the ground in London.
Trump rally in front of the American embassy.
Bringing you on-the-scene reports about Brexit. LN reported that COVID-19 was more virulent but less deadly weeks before others. LibertyNation.com delivers tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Liberty Nation Radio, the Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles and a new Roku channel. Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So here we are now, just over 3 months away from Election Day, November 3rd, and public polls continue to show Joe Biden with a healthy lead over President Trump. But let's not forget that Biden's a guy who made it through the primaries only because the Democratic Party was desperate to take down Bernie Sanders and his socialist agenda, so they essentially ran every other candidate out of the race. But these days, it's hard to distinguish between the positions of the old-time liberal Joe Biden and the progressive firebrand Bernie Sanders. Joining us to discuss what the Biden agenda really is and why he continues to lead in the polls despite hardly showing his face in public is LibertyNation.com political columnist Joe Schaeffer. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Tim. How are you?
I'm doing well, and welcome back. Always good to have you. Is Joe Biden essentially channeling Bernie Sanders with his progressive campaign platform?
Well, I guess you can say he is. I liked your introduction there because it really spells it out. And what's going on here is a deceit. It's an attempt to deceive the American public. Joe Biden isn't a progressive. The party is demanding that he be a progressive, yet they chose him because he's supposedly more electable. So they're running a candidate who is not what he is claiming to be in a post 2016 American climate where people have said we want honesty with our politicians. It's not so much, oh, he's got an R in his name, he's got a D. We want real people who are going to mean what they say. And the Democrats, again, we've been saying it over and over, they're running an old style campaign. You know, this might have been great in 1976. It's not 1976 anymore. Can you lie to the American people and get elected? I have my doubts with a weak candidate like Joe Biden. He's not exactly, charismatic and influential. So we'll see.
Joe Schaeffer, the master of understatement. Joe, is it fair or unfair to say that Joe Biden is in favor of defunding the police?
Again, it's fair to say that he's stating that he's in favor of that. He's going along with this hard left agenda. He's making smiley faces to the Black Lives Matter radicals. But again, he doesn't believe any of this stuff. So yeah, Joe Biden might say something that we could say, hey, he's for favoring defunding police. But the bigger issue to me is we all know he doesn't believe any of this stuff. And I think in the long run, that is going to hurt him more politically, his phoniness, than the radical things that the progressive base is pressuring him to say.
Interesting take. Now, the polls have not tightened that much since we last spoke here about 3 weeks ago. Biden still up by an average of 8.5 points in the national polls, according to Real Clear Politics. Do you still believe these polls are all wrong?
A broken clock is right twice a day, or that expression. It's to me, it's not right or wrong. I do think they're wrong, by the way, but it's not that. It's you don't deserve my trust. You showed me, especially in 2016, that you're flagrantly partisan, that Hillary's got a 93% chance of winning, all that stuff, and you were spectacularly wrong. There's just no reason to believe what you're saying. So it's not, to me, they're right, they're wrong. It's you don't matter. You're not giving me any useful information. So I throw out those polls, and it doesn't mean, hey, Trump's in a wonderful position. It just, this information does not matter.
Well, last time the polls got it completely wrong because they just couldn't figure the Trump voters. But now, with every word a white person says in public being parsed, would you expect the so-called silent vote for Trump to be larger or smaller this time, and is it likely to be decisive?
Well, that's an outstanding point. These people, these pollsters, people aren't telling them the truth. Why do you want to say something where you could get in trouble, you could be punished, mind crimes just for telling them that you're going to vote for President Trump? So that's going to underperform his numbers. But again, like I said, I don't believe in them anyway. I believe if there was overwhelming evidence that Trump was winning the polls, they would twist and distort it in some way to change that. They just don't deserve the American people's trust in any way, shape, or form.
Well, let's talk about the president. Is Donald Trump, in your view, conveying a winning message? And if not, what's he doing wrong?
Yeah, I really don't think he is. I'm surprised that this keeps going on, that he does not go back to, he talks about his instinct. I think his instincts are right, to connect with the people, a populist America First message, which is why he won in 2016. He's getting bad advice. I'm glad to see he shook up his campaign staff a little bit, got Brad Parscale out of the top role. They want to run this kind of a normative political machine campaign, reaching out to people that probably aren't going to vote for him anyway, trying to expose Joe Biden for previous tough on crime comments he made. Well, most Trump voters are tough on crime. They want him to be the law and order candidate, and bringing up some quote Joe Biden said in 1994 about getting tough on crime It's not going to help get Trump elected. What is going to help is him emphasizing that he'll crack down on these protests in the streets. I think the whole thing with the secret federal police, that's great for Trump. People want to say, hey, he's doing something. These Democratic mayors are letting their cities burn and Trump is stepping in. So this is all positive messaging. And do his advisors realize that, when he's taking heat from the establishment, he's doing something right.
Can Joe Biden win the election by continuing to do what he's been doing, staying in his basement and saying nothing, proposing nothing, coming out of the cave every once in a while for a friendly interview on CNN or MSNBC?
I would say no, but I never thought Joe Biden was going to be the nominee. I was as adamant as that as possible. So I think it's crazy that he even got to this position. How do you win hiding from the American people in a general election? Well, you do it with a coronavirus pandemic, which is, going to help him. Let's keep everyone locked down so he can't go out and interact with the American people. And having all this crisis theater, these protests in the streets, all the chaos helps him. But ultimately, at some point, doesn't he have to stand up and tell the American people what he is really about? The Democrats seem to be hoping, no, they can run out the clock and not make Joe Biden have to do that. It seems impossible to me that he could win that way. Yet here he is as the presumptive Democratic nominee. And I thought that was impossible in a rapidly progressive Democratic Party a few months ago. So who knows? It's a crazy year. I think Trump is looking very strong, much stronger than people say.
All bets are off, it seems, because the whole context of the election has flipped completely in the last 6 months. But when Joe Biden comes out of his basement, or when he does, it's going to be, as of now, for 3 debates that are scheduled September 29th, October 15th, and 22nd, vice presidential debate October 7th. As of now, those debates are on. Can Joe Biden beat President Trump in a debate? And if he thinks he can't, will he try to pull out?
I think you're going to see him try to pull out. I think he knows that that's going to be a disaster. Him face to face with Trump, maybe once, but and he can dodge and get on his bicycle and try to avoid the big punches. I don't think he could survive 3 times. Look at what the situation he's being put in. The progressive base is demanding he says things that is going to alienate the voters he needs in a general election. If he says the things that will attract more moderate voters, his base is going to become furious with him. So he's going to take heat either way. He can't win, and he's dealing with this unconventional politician who's just quick on his feet, made for the debate scenario, which I think he showed, especially in the Republican primaries in 2015. I think Trump's going to eat his lunch in a one-on-one debate, and I think they know that. So, no, I think they're going to try and keep him in his basement as long as they possibly can.
Well, the New York Times suggested that Biden should declare that he'll take part in a debate only with the 2 conditions that Trump releases his tax returns and that a real-time fact-checking team approved by both candidates be hired by the Commission on Presidential Debates. So they're already laying the predicate, the groundwork for saying he's not going to debate unless Trump agrees to these completely reasonable terms.
And what's interesting about that, very interesting about that, is that the Biden campaign has already followed the directives of the New York Times editorial staff. Another Democratic strategist wrote an op-ed basically spelling out how they should treat Biden during the coronavirus pandemic. Keep him in his basement, have him do interviews with lots of local news people. They thought that would be safe and harmless. And actually it didn't work out very well because he just did the same gaffes on local news that he would do on national news. But what was most interesting about that is they pretty much followed the game plan of this writer for the New York Times. So again, I say, do they really have a plan for this guy besides hiding him? I don't think they really have an idea for how to present him. If they have to get him out of his basement and have to present him to the American people, they don't have a coherent message. because again, you're trying to deceive with this campaign. We all know he's a career politician, that this is the capstone to his career that started in Washington, D.C. in 1973. That's all he wants. It's a personal thing with him. He wants to be president. And you can't sell that to the American people in 2020. I think they are at a loss how to sell this guy. And so they'll listen to the New York Times. They'll listen to Elizabeth Warren or Joe. They'll listen to Bernie Sanders. They'll listen to anybody. But I think hiding is really the only way that he can win. And I don't think he can win doing that.
Okay, Mr. Schaeffer, thanks again.
Thank you.
Joe Schaeffer, political columnist for LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we have reached what I call the heart of the matter on Liberty Nation Radio, the segment that we call Talkin' Liberty. And it's when we're rejoined by our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor. But forget all of that. What he actually is, meaningfully beyond all else, is our guardian of individual liberty, Scott D. Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Well, I'm puffed up to 6'5" here, Tim. That's how I'm doing.
Well, I'm trying to get you as pumped as possible.
For sure.
Let's talk about federal, and I'm using air quotes here, secret police activity in Portland and Chicago and Philadelphia, as if it is like the East German Stasi that's being sent by Trump to these cities.
It's that's right. So firstly, I think that for the sort of camo-wearing secret police types, it's only in Portland to date. There's federal law enforcement activity in those other cities, and Trump's talked about it. But right now, only in Portland do we actually have them on the ground. And it's one of these things where I think people who care about liberty and fidelity to the Constitution, like myself, reject the notion that there should be any broad or even perhaps less than broad federal law enforcement power, but also recognize that the idea that the federal government doesn't currently have that power under our laws and statutes as recognized, I think is fantastic and silly. It's one of these things where it's like, where have you been? Yes, you're right. This is awful. But also, we've gotten here because of the last, 50, 100 years of encroachment in our liberty. So while I think that the behavior of the federal officers is not commensurate with an appropriate reading of our Constitution and the powers that it gives the federal government, I also know that this is something that the federal government does all the time. We've talked, Tim, about 3 felonies a day many times on this show, and those are federal felonies we're talking about, not state ones.
Well, now let me ask you this question then. Let's just take Portland, but it's relevant to other cities as well. If the politicians who've been elected to lead those cities and to protect the people of those cities and to assure safety are unwilling to do it to the extent that they're not protecting federal property, federal facilities that are under attack, who should protect that federal property and those federal facilities, if not federal agents?
When these federal officers act in defense of federally owned property, Tim, that's probably their strongest case for being there and their actions. But what they do to protect that property has come under criticism that I think is warranted.
Specifically what?
Specifically, seizing people off the street without sufficient probable cause to necessitate an arrest, and then taking them elsewhere for questioning. And that's the charge of kidnapping, which I believe, at least in some of these cases, may technically be true. Now, I'm not saying that the people who were seized didn't commit federal crimes. It seems like the evidence indicates that they have, or the allegations rather suggest that they have. But the act of taking someone off a street without sufficient cause to arrest them, that is that's not legal. The Federal Protective Service chief has admitted to that very activity in Portland. So the federal government is struggling to deal with the crisis in Portland. There is zero help from state and local authorities, right, and people are amassed nightly around that building to try to break in and burn it down.
Repeatedly.
Absolutely.
And again, the political leadership in Portland and in the state of Oregon refuse to do anything about it, which makes me think that the nuanced argument of the way they're dealing with it is going to be lost on voters who are like, he has to do something, and if it's excessive, at least he's doing something. But that's up to the voters to decide. Scott, on a related story in some sense about probable cause, justifiable actions in the kind of climate, supercharged racial climate we're in now, let's talk about Mark McCloskey, the guy from St. Louis.
And his wife.
And his wife, who were charged, who this week were charged with felonies for wielding guns to protect their property after protesters had broken through the gate in their community, and they say they were protecting themselves, but apparently that's not flying.
Tim, it's a Soros prosecutor, Kim Gardner, who's been accused of being sort of an anti-Second Amendment activist, and I think the record bears that out with her tweets and social media profile. But she has offered the McCloskeys a diversionary program from her office. And
what is a diversionary program?
So it's kind of, it's one thing where I don't know if her offer is genuine or kind of a joke, but it's like this is the kind of thing that she was elected to institute, which is you get these sort of underprivileged youth who get in trouble, and they get, instead of a criminal record, if they keep their nose clean for a certain amount of time, they go into the diversionary program, and then therefore, the charges are dismissed without a record. So I don't know if that's a serious effort to bring the McCloskeys into sort of in line with the law. I can tell you their gun handling, Tim, was very troublesome to watch for anybody who knows how to handle a gun.
But that wasn't what they're charged with, mishandling a weapon.
I think they're charged with being Trump supporters, aren't they?
Oh,
no.
yes.
No, they're not Trump supporters. They're actually not Trump supporters.
They're not Trump. They actually aren't, huh?
No, if the legacy media informs me, Tim, that they're Democrat. They're trial lawyers, so they're
they're Democrats.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
almost 100%.
But what they do at least is they believe in the right to keep and bear arms, and so that's enough, I think, for Ms. Gardner to see them as the enemy.
Well, they at least believe in it for themselves.
Yes, sir.
And for others, we don't know yet. Well, here we go again with Trump and undocumented immigrants who he now has said he's going to try to restrict from the census.
And so these are illegal aliens, which we're talking about. People who are...
Scott, they're undocumented immigrants.
And it seems quite clear to me, just like those people are here illegally, they also must be counted in the census. The U.S. Constitution in the 14th Amendment and in Article 2
it says people.
Yes, it says people.
It doesn't say.
It says whole people, I think, in one instance, and in another instance, people, and then there's like exclusions for slaves and Indians. And
so there's no exclusion for people who were here illegally because there weren't any then.
Well,
I mean, that's...
Tim, it's until the First World War, you could travel across any international boundary in the entire world with any amount of currency and a .45 under your hip and not break a law. And boy, weren't those the good times.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue, with our own Mark Angelides, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, now more than ever, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.